He had grease under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing ever fully removed. That was the first thing people noticed about Birch Aldrich, and it was the thing he had long since stopped apologizing for. The grease was not dirt, it was a record. Every engine he had ever opened, every seal he had ever replaced, every piece of broken machinery he had ever coaxed back to life, had left something behind in the creases of his hands, and he had come to think of it the way other men thought of calluses or scars. It was proof of work. It was the only kind of proof that had ever meant anything to him. He was 34 years old on the morning that everything changed, and he did not know yet that it was the morning everything would change. He knew only that it was a Tuesday in late April, that his daughter was asleep in the backseat of his truck, and that the letter in his shirt pocket felt heavier than paper had any right to feel. He had read it 4 times. The bathroom mirror had watched him read it, and the 3 things taped to the glass had watched him too. Bex's school schedule, handwritten in his own blocky print, because she liked seeing it there every morning. An electric bill 10 days past due, the red final notice stamp faded slightly from humidity, but still legible enough. And a photograph, small corners soft, from handling of Waverly Aldrich, standing in front of a barn door, with a bitten-off grin, and both hands covered in the same grease his son would carry for the rest of his life. Those 3 things, in that order, were the shape of Birch's life. His daughter first. The obligations that kept them standing second. His father last but never forgotten. The letter was from Warren Houck, 40% rent increase effective the first day of next quarter. 60 days to vacate if the new rate could not be met. Birch had been expecting it for 2 weeks. He had known it was coming the way you know a storm is coming when the light goes wrong in the afternoon, that particular yellow-gray shift, that means something serious is moving in your direction. Knowing it was coming had not made holding the paper easier. He folded it back into thirds and slid it into his shirt pocket and stood in front of the mirror for a moment without moving. Behind the aspirin bottle in the medicine cabinet, there was an envelope. He had put it there himself years ago, so it would not be in plain sight, but would not be lost. His father had pressed it into his hand 2 weeks before the end, when Waverly Aldrich still had enough clarity to speak in complete sentences and enough stubbornness to say the important things plainly. The outside of the envelope said in his father's careful print, "Open when you don't know what to do anymore." Birch had not opened it. He had held it 11 times in 12 years. He had turned it over in his hands, felt the slight weight of whatever single page was folded inside and put it back. Not because he was afraid of what it said, because he had decided at some point he could not precisely name that he needed to arrive at the answer himself before he read whatever answer his father had left him. That when he finally opened it, he wanted to be able to say, "I figured it out." The envelope is a gift, not a rescue. This morning he took it out, held it, looked at the handwriting for a long time. Then he put it back. He was not ready yet. He still had options he had not exhausted. He told himself that as he walked down the hall to wake Bex, and he almost believed it. Bex Aldrich was 7 years old and had her mother's coloring, which is to say she was light-haired and fair-skinned in a way that made her look like she belonged in a different landscape than the flat brown and green expanse of Grover Falls, Nebraska. She had Birch's eyes, though, that particular shade of gray that people sometimes called blue, and the directness that came with them. Bex looked at things, really looked in a way that made adults slightly uncomfortable and other children slightly in awe of her. She was sitting up in the backseat of the truck before they cleared the end of the driveway, already reaching for the library book she kept in her backpack. Astronomy. Volume 2 of a series she had started 3 months ago, methodically working her way through the sections on orbital mechanics. She did not look up when Birch merged onto the county road. She did not ask where they were going because Norma Platt, who usually watched her on days like this, had called that morning with a cough that sounded like it meant business, and Bex had heard the conversation and drawn her own conclusions without needing them spelled out. This was one of the things about Bex that Birch found alternately comforting and slightly heartbreaking. She understood things too quickly. She adapted without complaint. She had learned very young that complaining did not change the situation and had simply stopped doing it, and Birch sometimes wondered whether that was a strength or a coping mechanism, and whether at age 7 there was a meaningful difference. His phone buzzed on the center console. He glanced at it. 3 words from a number he knew by memory now, though he had saved it under a name that felt accurate, Thad Sorrell. Offer still open. Birch set the phone face down. Thad Sorrell was 52 years old and ran Stone Barn Mechanical, a franchise that had opened 12 miles outside Grover Falls 18 months ago and had been absorbing Birch's customer base steadily ever since. Stone Barn had computerized diagnostic machines and a fleet of service vehicles and an advertising budget that put its name on the back of every high school sports program in the county. Birch had experience and honesty and a reputation that mattered to older farmers, and older farmers were retiring or selling out, moving their acreage into the hands of corporate operations that called the big franchises directly. 3 months ago, Thad had walked into Aldrich Mechanical wearing a suit jacket that cost more than Birch's monthly rent and had laid a bank check on the workbench with the particular casualness of a man who expected it to be picked up. The number on the check was enough to pay every outstanding debt Birch carried, with enough left over to start something smaller somewhere else, something without his father's name on the sign. Birch had looked at the check for exactly as long as it took to understand what it represented. Then he had slid it back across the bench and said with a calm he had to work to maintain that he appreciated the offer and was not interested. Thad had smiled the way people smile when they are not actually surprised and said he understood completely and would check back in a few months. On his way out, he had paused at the door and looked at the sign above it, Aldrich Mechanical. The letters faded slightly at the edges, but still readable, and said, "You're trying to hold on to something your father built. I respect that, but the world that thing was built for doesn't exist anymore." Birch had not answered because there was nothing to say that would not have cost him something he was not willing to spend. Now 6 miles from home, his phone showed a message from Larry Dodd, a mechanic in the next town over who had known Birch's father and occasionally passed along things worth knowing. The message was brief. "Heard Brad Houck talking to somebody from Stone Barn last week about the property on Route 9. Not sure what it means, but thought you should know." Birch read it twice. Route 9. His property. The barn his shop occupied the half-acre it sat on the gravel drive that Bex had learned to ride a bicycle on. The property that belonged to Warren Houck, whose 40% increase letter was currently sitting in Birch's shirt pocket. He thought about Thad's text, offer still open. He thought about the timing. He thought about Brad Houck Warren's son, 43 years old, recently back from Denver, and by all accounts pushing his father to convert the family's land holdings into cash. Brad Houck and Thad Sorrell. He turned those two names over in his mind, the way he turned a component over in his hands when he was trying to understand what it connected to and what it was connected by. He picked up his phone and called Warren Houck. The line rang 9 times and went to voicemail. In 11 years, Warren Houck had never not answered when Birch called. Birch set the phone down. The truck moved through the flat April landscape fields, just beginning to show the earliest suggestion of green, that tentative color that arrives before you are sure it is really coming. Bex turned a page without looking up. The morning felt ordinary in the way that mornings sometimes feel ordinary right before they stop being ordinary. He drove. He did not have a destination. This happened sometimes when the walls of his thinking got too close, and he needed the road under him to push them back. He turned onto County Road 7 without deciding, to the way you sometimes end up in a room without remembering walking toward it. The road was empty, straight running between winter bare fields that were just beginning to consider becoming something green again. He saw the tractor from 100 yards out. It was a John Deere the 2001 model. He would have guessed from the body lines sitting at an angle in the shallow drainage ditch along the left side of the road. The engine hood was propped open with the rod. Standing beside it, wearing a wide-brimmed canvas hat, the color of dried earth, was a woman who appeared to be somewhere in her late 60s. She had a phone pressed to her ear, but she was not talking. She lowered it, looked at the screen, then looked up at the sky with an expression that was not distress and not patience exactly, but something in between. Like a person who has been in difficult situations before and has developed a private protocol for waiting them out. Birch slowed. He rolled down the window. "Need a hand," he called. She looked at him. Her eyes were dark and sharp and did not carry the helplessness he might have expected in someone stranded on an empty road. They carried something else, an evaluation. "Depends on whether you know what you're looking at," she said. He pulled over. He got out. He told Bex he would be right back, and she said okay without looking up from her book. The woman's name was Loretta Creedy, though she introduced herself simply as Lore, and her handshake was firm in the way of someone who had never learned to offer a soft one and saw no reason to start. She was wearing canvas work pants that had been washed many times and muddy boots with the particular red clay mud that came from the low ground near the river bend 6 miles east. Birch noted the mud the way he noted things because details were information, and information was how you understood what you were dealing with. He looked at the engine. He did not touch anything for the first 90 seconds. He looked at the fuel line, the injection housing, the timing components, the way the machine sat in relation to the road, the faint smell of unburned diesel that lingered around the open hood. Fuel injection pump, he said, cracked seal, and the timing has been off for a while, probably 3 or 4 weeks at minimum. This did not fail this morning. It was failing gradually, and this morning it finished. She said nothing. He could feel her watching him the way she might watch someone solve a problem she already understood the solution to. Can you fix it here? She asked. Not properly, but I can get it running well enough to drive off the road. You will need a real repair within the next day or two, or you are going to end up with a bigger failure than a cracked seal. When the seal goes unaddressed, the pressure drop causes the timing to drift further, and at that point, you are looking at injector damage on top of everything else. He went to his truck and came back with a rolled canvas kit of basic tools and 2 or 3 materials he kept on hand because in his experience, the middle of nowhere tended to present situations that rewarded preparation. He began working. She asked him 3 questions over the next 20 minutes, and they were not the questions of a person trying to make conversation. They were technical questions. She asked about the timing mechanism and what long-term misalignment would do to the injector wear pattern. She asked about the lifespan comparison between a rebuilt pump and a factory new unit in a machine this age. She asked how he was addressing the seal without the proper gasket compound. He answered each question directly. He told her what he was doing and why. He did not perform expertise or cushion the explanations. He talked to her the way he talked to other mechanics. When he had the tractor running, rough but functional, he straightened up and wiped his hands. That is the best I can do out here. Do not push it past 20 miles an hour and get it to a shop by tomorrow. I will write down who I would send you to. He went back to the truck for a piece of paper and a pen. When he turned around, Bex was standing beside Laura Creedy. He did not know when she had gotten out of the truck. Bex was like that sometimes. She appeared. She was looking up at the open hood with the focused expression she brought to anything mechanical, which was the same expression she brought to her astronomy books, into maps, into the insides of things she found on the ground and took apart. Do you have a farm? Bex asked. Not hello, directly to the point she cared about. I do, Laura said. Do you like it? A pause. Not a social pause. A real one. Every day, Laura said. Some days I like it more than others, but yes, every day. Bex considered this and appeared to find it satisfactory. She looked at the engine. My dad explained about the pump. He said it is like the heart of the machine. If the heart beats wrong, the whole thing stops working. Laura looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in her expression, something small and quick that Birch caught from the corner of his eye while he was writing down the shop name. Then she looked back at the engine with the same careful attention Bex had been giving it. Birch handed Laura the piece of paper. She took it and read it and folded it precisely and put it in her chest pocket. What do I owe you? She said. Nothing. She looked at him. You were stuck and I could help, he said. I do not think a person should be charged for somebody doing what is right. She was quiet for a moment. Bex had wandered back toward the truck, stopping to look at something in the grass along the road's edge. Laura watched her go and then looked back at Birch, and there was something in her look that he could not quite name, some quality of attention that was different from how she had been looking at him before. What is your shop called? She said. Aldrich Mechanical. It is in Grover Falls. He handed her a card. Plain stock, just the name and number and address, the same cards he had printed 6 years ago and had been slowly using up ever since. She held the card without looking at it immediately. She held it the way you hold something you are not quite done deciding about. Then she tucked it into the same pocket as the piece of paper. Thank you, Birch. He nodded. He got Bex settled back in the truck and they drove. He did not think much about Laura Creedy on the way home. He was thinking about Thad Sorrell and Brad Houck and the 9 rings of an unanswered phone and the 40% written in the letter that was still in his pocket. He was thinking about the conversation he was going to have the options he needed to lay out clearly the things he could do and the things he could not. He was thinking about the envelope in the medicine cabinet. The shop was a converted barn at the edge of a half-acre lot on Route 9, and it had been his father's repair space before it was his, informally, the place Waverly Aldrich brought machines when a neighbor needed help, and the help was the kind that required space and tools and time. Birch had taken it over formally 6 years ago, signed the lease with Warren Houck, painted the sign above the door, and begun the slow process of building something that was supposed to grow. It had not grown the way he planned. Stone Barn had opened. The older farmers who trusted Birch because they had trusted. His father began to disappear one by one from the customer list, selling land or retiring or dying. And the operations that absorbed their acreage, called the franchise centers, without asking around first. The shop had been surviving for 3 years instead of thriving, which was a different thing entirely, and Birch knew the difference the way you know the difference between a machine running well and a machine running because it has not stopped yet. Inside the shop on the second hook from the left on the tool wall hung a set of 3/8-inch wrenches arranged in the order his father had hung them. The order had no rational basis that Birch had ever been able to determine. It was just the order Waverly had used, the sequence he reached for without thinking, and Birch had kept it because changing it felt like a small but meaningful erasure. The logbook was on the corner of the workbench. Green cover spine cracked from years of being open flat. Waverly Aldrich had started it in 1987. Careful handwriting that grew less careful as the years passed, and Birch had continued it from the page following his father's last entry. There was a gap in the middle, 2 weeks in January of the year Waverly died, where Birch had not written anything because he had not been able to work and had not known what to write. The gap was still there. He had decided not to fill it in. He sat on the stool beside the bench and opened the logbook and stared at the current page without reading it. He had been honest with himself about the shop's situation for a long time. The rent increase would not destroy him immediately, but it would remove the margin he had been operating on the slim difference between keeping the lights on and not being able to. He had 60 days. He had done the math. He needed either a substantial new client or a significant reduction in operating costs, and he did not see either arriving naturally within 60 days. He was still sitting in there when his phone rang again. Unknown number, Nebraska area code he did not recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. He picked up on the fourth ring. Is this Birch Aldrich, owner of Aldrich Mechanical? The voice was professional and measured the voice of someone who delivered important information to strangers regularly and had learned to do it cleanly. It is. My name is Bowen Birdsong. I am the legal director and operations manager for Crestfield Agricultural Holdings. Mrs. Loretta Creedy asked me to contact you. Birch was very still. He knew that name. He thought he might have known it before he was consciously aware of knowing it, the way you sometimes know a face a half second before you know the name that goes with it. Crestfield Agricultural Holdings. He had seen it on grain elevator signage in 3 counties. He had heard it mentioned by farmers, the way certain names get mentioned, not as companies exactly, but as facts of the landscape. Regarding what Birch said, she would like to discuss a potential service contract. Would you be available to meet with me tomorrow morning? After he hung up, Birch sat in the quiet of the empty shop for a long time. Bex was doing homework at the small desk he had set up for her in the corner, not asking questions, giving him the space she seemed to know he needed without being told. The logbook was still open in front of him. His father's handwriting was visible at the top of the page from an entry made 20 years before either of them knew what the next 20 years would look like. Birch typed the name into his phone. The results came back in seconds. Forbes agricultural profile, net worth estimated in the billions. 7 states, grain processing equipment, leasing, seed distribution, irrigation technology. And at the top, Loretta Creedy, 68, built from a single inherited farm over 4 decades, still personally involved in day-to-day operations. The woman in the muddy boots. He set his phone down. He looked at the envelope in his mind's eye, sitting behind the aspirin bottle, waiting for the moment he decided he needed it. Not yet. The week before the rent letter arrived, Augusta Aldrich had called him on a Wednesday evening. He had been in the shop finishing a service log when the phone rang and he had seen her name on the screen and sat with it for a moment before answering. Augusta was 59 years old and called perhaps 4 times a year, conversations that were brief and circling, neither of them quite saying the things that needed saying. This call was different in quality from the first sentence. She had heard, she said, that Birch was having difficulties. She did not say how she had heard. She said that her husband, a man named Royce, who worked in financial services in Omaha, had connections at a regional bank and might be able to help with a restructured loan. She said this carefully, the way a person says something they have rehearsed enough to know where the soft spots are. Birch had thanked her and said he would think about it. He had not thought about it because what Augusta was describing was not a loan. It was an opening, and openings had terms attached, even when the terms were not stated yet. He called Gus Sullen at 11 o'clock that night. Gus was 61 and handled real estate closings and small business contracts in Grover Falls, and he had been friends with Waverly Aldrich long enough that he answered his phone after 10 when Birch's name appeared on the screen. Gus, I need two things and I need them before 8 tomorrow morning. Go ahead. I need you to find out if there is any legal or financial connection between Crestfield Agricultural Holdings and a company called Stone Barn Mechanical or its owner, Thad Sorrell. A pause. All right, what is the second thing? My mother called last week. Augusta. She made a claim about a debt my father owed to her family. No documentation. I need you to go through my father's financial records and tell me whether there is anything that supports that claim. Another pause longer this time. Augusta Aldrich showed up. She did. First time in how long? Long enough that it is not a coincidence she is showing up now. Birch looked at the workbench, at the logbook, and at the tools on the wall in the order his father had hung them. Something is moving, Gus. I do not know the shape of it yet. I need to know what I am standing on before I take the next step. Gus said he would have answers by 7:30. He said it without dramatics, the way a man says something when he means it. Birch thanked him and hung up and sat in the quiet of the shop a while longer before he went inside to check on Bex. She was asleep with the astronomy book open on her chest, one arm thrown over the edge of the bed, the way she always slept, and the nightlight in the corner made the room amber and soft. Birch stood in the doorway and looked at her for a moment, this particular version of her, at 7 still small enough that the bed looked large around her. He thought about the woman on County Road 7 looking down at Bex with an expression he could not quite name. He thought about Bex saying the pump is like the heart of the machine, the way she had said it without performance or effort, the way she said things that were simply true and needed to be said. He went to bed. He did not sleep well, but that was not unusual. He lay in the dark and thought about Thad Sorrell and the 3 words that were still sitting unread in his phone, and he thought about Warren Houck not answering, and he thought about the envelope and what his father might have written inside it, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, he fell into something close enough to sleep to count as rest. In the morning, Gus called at 7:22. No connection between Crestfield and Stone Barn, Gus said. Not direct, not through subsidiaries, not through any shared investors I can find. Clean separation. And my father's records. I went through everything you gave me 3 years ago when you set up the business accounts. There is no documentation of any loan or financial arrangement between Waverly Aldrich and Augusta's family. Nothing in the records supports what she described. Birch closed his eyes briefly. He had known this. He had known it the way you know something before the evidence confirms it. But confirmation still mattered. She will probably come back, Gus said. I know. What do you want to do if she does? I will handle his phone. Birch picked up the logbook from the bench and ran his thumb along the spine. Right now, I need you to look at a contract for me. I am meeting with the legal director of Crestfield Agricultural this morning, and I want you to review whatever they put in front of me before I sign anything. A longer silence than Birch expected. Then Gus said quietly, Crestfield Agricultural, Loretta Crady. Yes. Birch, how did that happen? I stopped on County Road 7. He did not explain further, and Gus, who had known Waverly Aldrich well enough to understand certain things about the men that family produced, did not ask him to. The morning Gus confirmed the contract was clean, Birch drove to meet Bowen Birdsong with the particular steadiness of a man who has decided to be steady because the alternative costs too much. The Crestfield Agricultural Regional Office was in a low brick building 20 minutes from Grover Falls, and Birdsong was already in the conference room when Birch arrived, a leather folder open in front of him and a legal pad beside it. He was exactly what his voice had suggested, measured, efficient, accustomed to the weight of his employer's name. The contract summary was 3 pages. Birch read all 3 without comment, turning the pages slowly. 3 Nebraska facilities, approximately 400 pieces of equipment ranging from planting machinery to combines to irrigation controllers. A 2-year term with renewal options. The monthly retainer was a number that Birch had to read twice. I would like my attorney to review the full documents before I sign anything, Birch said. Mrs. Creedy anticipated that, Birdsong said. We will transmit the complete contract to whoever you designate. Take the time you need. The absence of pressure told Birch something. Sales situations had a texture, a forward lean, and this meeting did not have it. He gave Birdsong Gus's contact information and shook his hand and walked out through the lobby. On the sidewalk, moving toward his truck, he registered the detail almost without thinking, a dark Ford Explorer parked 2 blocks down with a small decal in the lower corner of the rear window. Walker Equipment Service, the regional contractor that, according to Gus's research, had been Crestfield Agricultural's primary service provider for 7 years. The contractor that Thad Sorrell had worked with as a regional sales agent for the past 2. He photographed the license plate and sent it to Gus before he reached his truck. Gus called back 90 minutes later. The vehicle was registered to a man named Dale Pruitt, listed in corporate filings as a business development representative for Walker Equipment Service. Someone was watching the Crestfield offices, cataloging who came and went and why. Thad was not moving against Birch directly. He was gathering intelligence from the edges, building a picture, waiting for a moment to act on it. Birch filed this information and kept working. Gus reviewed the complete contract that evening and called with the kind of pause a man uses when he wants to make sure what he says next lands the way it should. He said the contract was legitimate in every provision. He said the terms were fair and in some respects generous. He said that if Birch performed the work it specified the financial situation of Aldrich, Mechanical would be transformed permanently, not improved temporarily, but changed in kind. He said Birch should understand what he was being offered and not minimize it out of caution. Birch signed the documents the following morning and drove home through fields that were moving from the pale hope of April into the more committed green of early May. He did not feel as he drove the way he might have expected to feel. He had imagined that signing a contract of this size would produce a sensation of arrival, of finally having crossed from one condition of life into another. What he felt instead was simpler and less dramatic, a quiet readiness. The kind of readiness that does not announce itself, but that you recognize when it is there. The steadiness of a machine that has been correctly calibrated and is now running at the right speed. He had work to do. That was what he felt. He had a great deal of work to do, and he knew how to do it, and he was going to begin. He stopped at the school on the way home to pick up Bex, who was waiting on the front steps with her backpack listing to one side the way it always did, the astronomy volume making it heavier on the left. She got in the truck and looked at him the way she looked at him when she was reading something in his expression and had not yet decided what it meant. "Something happened," she said. "Something happened," he agreed. She waited. "The shop is going to be all right," he said. "We are going to be all right." Bex looked at him for another moment, assessing, and then she opened her book to the page she had marked and went back to reading, which was her way of saying she had understood and did not need more than that right now. Birch watched the road and felt something ease in his chest that had been tight for longer than he could precisely account for. The first day at the Millard County facility, the person waiting for him was not the site manager. It was Sandra Dunbar. She was standing in the main equipment bay when Birch pulled in, holding a clipboard, and watching him get out of his truck with the particular attention of someone who had already formed an opinion and was deciding whether to revise it. She was 47 with the brisk, organized manner of a person who had spent years translating other people's poor decisions into line items on a spreadsheet and had grown permanently impatient with poor decisions as a result. She introduced herself as the Director of Operational Finance for the Nebraska facilities and made clear within the first 2 minutes of conversation that she had not been consulted on the hiring decision. "Walker Equipment has been our service provider for 7 years," she said. "They have a 12-person team, 3 dedicated diagnostic vehicles, and a full-service history going back to 2017. You have a single shop in Grover Falls." "I know Walker's work," Birch said. It was the only response that was both honest and worth making. She looked at him steadily. "Is that so?" "I have seen the service pattern on equipment that came through Walker. Some of it was good, some of it I would not have signed off on." Sandra held his gaze for a moment, and then without confirming or denying anything, turned and led him into the building. She showed him the equipment inventory with the efficiency of someone who had prepared the tour and intended to deliver it on schedule. What the inspection revealed over the first 3 days of assessment was a pattern. The hydraulic fittings and joint connectors on a significant portion of the machinery showed wear that was concentrated and consistent rather than general, not the wear of overuse, the wear of repeated thermal stress, the kind that accumulates when equipment is stored for winter without properly relieving hydraulic line pressure before the temperatures drop. When the fluid contracts in the cold and then expands again in spring warmth, that movement works on the fittings over years, creating microscopic fractures that widen gradually and present as failures that appear random but are not. Walker had been servicing this equipment for 7 years. No one had identified the pattern because no one had been reading the physical service records against the seasonal calendar. They had been reading diagnostic printouts, which show only what is failing now, not what has been quietly building. Birch documented everything in the logbook continued in the notation system his father had established and wrote the preliminary report in the same careful language Waverly Aldrich had always used specific measured without excess. He sent the report to Birdsong. The following morning, Birdsong called to say that Sandra had reviewed the draft and had questions about his methodology and whether the projected cost savings could be substantiated. Birch understood what this meant without needing it explained. He asked for a meeting, all three of them in person. Birdsong arranged it. The meeting lasted 90 minutes. Birch presented the findings without a slide deck from memory and from the logbook, walking through the evidence the way his father had taught him to walk through a diagnostic, starting from what you can observe, moving to what the observation implies, ending at what the implication requires. Sandra asked hard questions. Birch answered them. When Birdsong asked for clarification on the cost projection, Birch provided it with the qualifier that the number was a projection based on documented patterns and that actual savings would depend on implementation. At the end of it, Sandra said, "If you are wrong, this is an expensive mistake." Birch looked at her. "If I am right, it is the saving you have been leaving on the table for 4 years." She did not respond immediately. She looked at the logbook on the conference table, then back at Birch. She had the expression of a person who is not ready to agree, but is no longer certain of their disagreement. It was enough, for now. Outside the meeting room, walking back to his truck, Birch thought about what had just happened, not as a victory, but as a clarification. Sandra was not an obstacle to be overcome. She was a system doing what it was designed to do, protecting the organization from variables that had not yet proven themselves. The meeting had not changed her position. It had put the question on a foundation of evidence rather than preference, and that was all he could ask for right now. The rest would follow from the work, or it would not follow at all, and there was nothing he could do about that except keep working. He drove back to the Millard County facility and spent the rest of that day in the equipment barn, going through the irrigation controllers one by one, making the kind of notes that could not be made quickly. Bex was in the truck with her books. At 4:30, she came in without being asked and sat on an upturned crate near the door and watched him work in the way she had been watching him work since she was old enough to understand that watching was a form of learning. She did not interrupt. She did not ask questions until he stopped. When he stopped, she asked three, all of them, showing she had been following what he was doing closely enough to identify the points where his process was not yet clear to her. He answered each one. Then they drove home. This was the shape of the weeks that followed. Work and Bex watching the work and the logbook filling up with entries that continued the record Waverly Aldrich had started 37 years before. Birch did not think of it in those terms while it was happening. He thought about it only later, looking back the way you understand the weight of a period of your life only after it is past and you can see its outline from a distance. Thad Sorrell arrived at the Millard County facility on a Thursday in the third week of the contract. Thad Sorrell came as a Walker Equipment representative, presenting credentials to the site manager and citing a clause in the transition protocol that allowed Walker to conduct a final equipment review within 30 days of contract termination. The clause was real. Birdsong had missed it in the transition paperwork, and by the time anyone thought to question Thad's presence, he was already moving through the equipment bay with the deliberate casualness of a man who wants to appear as though he belongs somewhere. He stopped when he saw Birch, Aldrich, Sorrell. Thad looked around the bay slowly. One man, 400 pieces of equipment. He said it without hostility, which was more unsettling than hostility would have been. When something goes wrong, can you handle it alone? At that moment, from the north end of the bay came the sound that every person who works with machinery learns to classify automatically the irregular knock of a component operating under wrong conditions. One of the large combine units running through a post-maintenance test cycle had developed a rhythmic irregularity that had not been there at the start of the cycle. The operator shut it down. Thad looked at the combine, then he looked at Birch. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Birch walked to the machine. He opened the access panel on the hydraulic assembly and found it in under 2 minutes of fitting that had been reinstalled backward during Walker's last service visit on that unit, creating a partial flow restriction that only manifested under load. It was the systemic failure mode his report had flagged. The evidence was sitting in front of both of them. He looked at Thad. This is from the last Walker service on this unit. It is in the records. I will have it corrected in 2 hours. Something moved across Thad's face that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite concession, but lived in the space between them. Then he nodded once and turned and walked toward the entrance. He was gone before the 2 hours were up. That evening, Birdsong called. Sandra had sent an email to Loretta Crady directly formally requesting a review of the service contract in light of what she described as ongoing concerns about capacity and reliability. What did Mrs. Crady say? Birch asked. Birdsong paused. She said she would come to the facility herself. Laura arrived the following Tuesday without advance notice, which was as Birch was beginning to understand simply how she operated. She parked the same pickup he had seen on County Road 7 in an unmarked space and walked into the facility as though she had been there 10 minutes ago, rather than 6 months. She fell into step beside Birch as he worked through the second bay, asking questions the way she had asked them on County Road 7, specific, interested, genuinely wanting to understand. At no point did she ask the questions a person asks when they are verifying something they already suspect. She asked the questions of someone who had decided to learn. Bex was there that day, school out for a teacher development session. She had her notebook open at the corner work table, moving between her reading and the machines around her, with the calm familiarity of a child who had spent a great deal of her life in working spaces. Laura drifted toward the work table at a certain point, and Birch followed at a slight distance, watching. The notebook was open to a page where Bex had been diagramming the hydraulic circuit of one of the irrigation controllers she had watched Birch assess that morning. The diagram used two colors, orange for the high-pressure feed lines, blue for the return. You drew this today, Laura said. This morning while Dad was working. Bex looked at the diagram and then at Laura. I figured out if you use different colors, you can see where the pressure changes. Orange for high, blue for low. Then you can tell where the problem would be just by looking. Laura studied the drawing without speaking for a moment. Did someone teach you that system? No, I made it up. Bex looked at the page with the mild satisfaction of someone reviewing their own reasoning. It makes sense, though. Hot as orange, cool as blue. It is just what they feel like. It is exactly right, Laura said, and it is not obvious. Most people do not think of it that way. Bex accepted this without particular excitement, the way she accepted information that confirmed something she had already reasoned through. She asked Laura whether she wanted to see the part about the return circuit, and Laura sat down on the bench beside the table and looked at it with her. Birch stood back and watched his daughter explain her diagram to one of the most consequential agricultural operators in the country. What struck him was not the content of what Bex was saying. It was the quality of the conversation. Laura was not performing interest or being patient with Icone. She was actually engaged, listening with the same attention she brought to Birch's diagnostic explanations. Later, after Laura had completed her walkthrough, she paused near the bay entrance. Sandra's concern is not malicious, Laura said. She is protecting something she is responsible for. I know. She will come around when the numbers come in. Laura picked up her jacket from the hook by the door. The things Sandra is protecting and the things you are actually doing are not in conflict. She does not see that yet. She will. She left, and the bay settled back into its working quiet, and Birch stood for a moment in the space she had vacated before going back to the machine in front of him. He worked until 6 that evening, past the point where anyone else was still in the building, finishing the walkthrough of the third bay and making the final entries in the logbook for that section. The notation system he used was the same one his father had developed, which distinguished between observed condition, probable cause, and recommended action in a way that kept the three categories from bleeding into each other. The discipline of the distinction mattered. An observed condition was a fact. A probable cause was an interpretation. A recommended action was a judgment. Conflating them was how diagnostic errors happened, how people fixed the symptom, and left the cause in place to generate another symptom down the line. He closed the logbook and sat in the quiet bay for a moment before carrying it to the truck. The facility at night had a different quality than it did during the day, a settled heaviness that came from the equipment at rest, hundreds of machines waiting for the season's demands. He thought about how many of them were carrying the accumulated effects of years of incorrect winter storage, the invisible damage building in the fittings and joints with every cycle of freeze and thaw. He thought about how much of that damage was already done and how much of it he could slow by changing what happened going forward. He could not undo the past. He could change what the future added to it. That was true of machines and probably true of most other things. He drove home in the dark, and Bex was already asleep when he came in, and he stood in the doorway of her room the way he stood there most evenings. Not for long, just long enough to register the particular quality of the quiet that existed when she was sleeping safely in the next room and the day's obligations were finished. The next morning, before Birch arrived at the facility, Laura Crady walked into Sandra Dunbar's office and closed the door. Birch learned about this only afterward from Birdsong, who had heard about it from Sandra herself, which meant Sandra had considered it significant enough to mention. Laura had sat down across from Sandra without preamble and asked her a single question. Was Sandra's concern about the contract based on the performance data she had seen, or on a preference for the arrangement that had existed before Sandra had not answered immediately? Laura had waited. Sandra had said finally that the data so far was inconclusive because there was not enough of it yet. Laura had said that was a fair answer and that she would expect Sandra to bring her any concerns the moment the data became conclusive in either direction. Then she had stood up and left. No argument, no pressure, just a clear statement of what she expected and from whom. Sandra had told Birdsong about the conversation in a way that suggested she was still processing it. Birdsong told Birch in a way that suggested he thought Birch should know the ground he was standing on. Birch thanked him and kept working. Augusta Aldrich came back on a Saturday 2 weeks after Laura's visit. She drove up the gravel drive in the mid-morning, and Birch watched her through the shop window before he went out. He had been expecting her the way you expect weather you have already seen on the horizon. Augusta was 59 years old and had the self-possessed manner of a woman who believed on some fundamental level that her presence in any situation was a form of contribution. She had left the family when Birch was 14, not with noise or drama, but thoroughly in the way that leaves a particular kind of silence behind. He went outside. She had a piece of paper this time, a handwritten account of what she described as a verbal agreement between her former stepfather in Waverly Aldrich from 1998, a loan of equipment or capital, the specific details soft at the edges in the way that invented details tend to be. The story was different from what she had described on the phone the previous week. Birch noted the difference without commenting on it. I spoke to Gus, he said. He went through my father's complete financial records. There is no debt. There is no agreement. There is no arrangement of any kind between my father and your family that appears in any document he left behind. Augusta looked at the paper he was holding. Birch, there are things between families that do not always get written down properly. I know that sometimes things are not written down, he said, but my father was meticulous about money because he had to be. He wrote everything down. If there was a debt, there would be a record. There is no record. He gave the paper back to her. The morning was warm, the gravel bright in the late April sun, and somewhere in the shop behind him, he could hear Bex moving between rooms. The particular rhythm of footsteps. He knew the way he knew the sound of a correctly running engine. I heard things were going well for you now, Augusta said. The sentence was quieter than the ones before it, and it came from somewhere underneath the argument she had prepared. I heard about the new contract. Things are going better. Your father would be proud. Birch thought about this carefully, the way he thought about mechanical problems, not accepting the first explanation, but looking at what was underneath it. He thought about whether Waverly Aldrich would be proud of the contract itself or proud of the road and the tractor and the 20 minutes and the answer to a question about why. He thought those were different things and that his father would have understood the difference instantly. I think he would, Birch said. Yes. Augusta looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment, something showed through the prepared surface of her expression. Not regret for what she was about to lose because she had never had it. Something older. The distance between them had a particular shape that had been forming for 20 years, and she could see its outline from where she stood. He kept a logbook, Birch said. Did you know that a green notebook handwritten? He started it in 1987. I have been continuing it. She shook her head. I have his handwriting, Birch said, and mine, in the same book, side by side. He did not say anything else, and neither did she, and after a moment she got back in her car and drove down the gravel drive and was gone. He stood in the quiet morning for a while, then he went back inside. He thought standing in the shop with the sound of Bex moving in the house behind him about what it cost a person to come back twice with a claim that had no foundation. He did not think Augusta had invented the claim from nothing. He thought she had told herself a version of events that served her needs until she had convinced herself it was true and that this was a different kind of dishonesty than deliberate fabrication, but not necessarily a kinder one. It required a sustained effort not to see what you were doing. He thought about his father. He thought about the logbook and the gap in the middle, the 2 weeks where Birch had not written anything because he had not been able to work. He thought about what Waverly had done in the years after Augusta left, which was nothing dramatic, nothing that required explaining to Birch when he was old enough to ask. His father had simply continued, gone to work, made the entries in the logbook, taken the calls that needed answering, been present in the ways that presence is built day by day through the accumulation of ordinary reliability. Birch had been 14 when Augusta left, old enough to understand what was happening, and young enough that the absence had made a shape in him that he was still at 34 discovering the contours of. He did not carry it as a wound exactly. He carried it the way you carry any significant fact about your history as information about where you came from and therefore in some indirect way about where you were going. He wrote her a letter that afternoon at the kitchen table while Bex worked on her homework beside him, the two of them quiet together in the way they often were. He told Augusta that he had checked and there was nothing to settle, and that chapter of the conversation was finished. He told her that if she ever wanted to know her granddaughter genuinely, not as a means to anything else, but simply for the purpose of knowing her, she should contact him and they would talk about it. He sealed the envelope, put it with the outgoing mail, and did not revisit the decision. He did not hear from Augusta again after the letter. He had expected some response, a phone call, another visit, something. What he got was silence, and he sat with the silence for a few days before deciding that silence was the most honest thing Augusta had offered him in years. She had come for a reason that did not exist. When he made that clear, she had nothing left to bring. Silence was the appropriate result. Gus called 3 weeks after the letter was sent, not about Augusta, but about a separate matter Warren Houck had asked through his own attorney whether Birch would be willing to waive the remaining 30 days on the original 60-day notice in exchange for a small rent credit. It was a face-saving gesture from a man who had found himself caught between his son's ambitions in a 30-year relationship with his tenant, and Birch agreed to it without asking for the credit. Warren called himself 2 days later, the call Birch had been waiting for since the morning on County Road 7, when the phone had rung 9 times and gone to voicemail. Warren was 71 years old and had the voice of a man carrying something heavier than he let on. He said he was sorry about the way things had gone. He said he had not understood what Brad was doing until it was already done. He said Birch's father had been a good man, and he hoped Birch knew he thought so. Birch said he knew. He said he did not hold Warren responsible for decisions his son had made. He said the thing he meant, which was that some distances between fathers and sons were not the fault of either man, but of the space that opens between generations when the world moves faster than the relationship can accommodate. Warren was quiet for a moment after that. Then he said he appreciated it, and they hung up, and Birch sat in the shop thinking about fathers and sons for a while before he went inside to make dinner. The first quarterly financial report came in 6 weeks later. $163,000 in avoided repair costs at the Millard County facility alone. The number was not something Birch had calculated or engineered. It was what the work produced when the work was done correctly and the recommendations were followed. Sandra Dunbar reviewed the report and sent it to Birdsong without comment. Birdsong forwarded it to Lore. Lore did not respond by email. She called Birdsong instead, and Birdsong told Birch the following morning that Mrs. Creedy wanted to meet with him in Lincoln at her personal office at his earliest convenience. Birch set the call down and looked at the logbook on the bench. He thought about what Gus had said when he signed the first contract. He thought about Sandra sitting across from him in the meeting room, telling him that if he was wrong, it would be expensive. He thought about the report in Birdsong's hands with the number at the bottom that was simply what happened when a pattern was understood and addressed. He called Birdsong back and said he could be in Lincoln on Friday. He spent the drive to Lincoln the next Friday in the particular silence that settles over a person when they have stopped rehearsing what they are going to say and accepted that the conversation will go the way it goes. Bex was in school. The fields on either side of the highway had moved past the pale uncertainty of April and into something more committed now, the deep color of a Nebraska Mayrose emerging from the dark soil in lines so deliberate they seemed intentional even from a distance. The Crestfield Agricultural Headquarters was a 3-story brick building in a part of Lincoln that had been commercial for a long time, the kind of block where buildings wore their age without apology. No glass atrium, no corporate logo illuminated above the entrance, a wooden door with a brass handle that had been polished by decades of hands. Birch pushed it open and told the woman at the front desk his name and sat in a chair in a waiting area lined floor to ceiling on two walls with bookshelves. Not decorative bookshelves. Working ones filled with binders and technical manuals and agricultural journals going back 30 years. Laura met him at the door of her office herself. She was wearing the same kind of clothes she wore in the field canvas trousers and a plain shirt, and the boots were different from County Road 7, but carried the same history of outdoor use. She shook his hand and let him in and closed the door. No bird song, no Sandra. Just the two of them and a pot of coffee on the corner of a desk covered in actual paperwork. The office told him things. There were no plaques on the walls, no framed magazine covers, no photographs with senators or executives. There was one photograph on the desk angled so it faced the person sitting behind it rather than any visitor. A man, older, standing in front of a tractor that Birch recognized as a late 60s model, its paint long gone to rust at the edges. The man was not smiling for the camera. He was squinting at something off to the left, as though something in the middle distance had caught his attention, and he was deciding what to make of it. Laura poured 2 cups without asking how he took his and set one in front of him and sat down. She did not rush into the purpose of the meeting. That was something Birch had observed in her from the beginning. She treated time the way she treated resources, not as something to be filled, but as something to be used well. And using time well sometimes meant sitting with a cup of coffee in a working office and letting the air settle before you said the thing you came to say. She asked about Bex first, not as a pleasantry. She wanted to know. Birch told her that Bex had moved on from the orbital mechanics series and was now working through a set of engineering primers she had found at the county library that her teacher had called last week to say she was explaining concepts to other students in a way the teacher herself found useful. Laura listened with the focused attention she brought to everything, and then she asked a question that surprised him. Does she know what her father does? Not the name of it, what it actually is. Birch considered that for a moment. She knows that machines break in ways that follow patterns. She knows that if you understand the pattern, you can fix the thing, and if you can fix the thing, somebody's harvest gets in and somebody's family eats. She knows that. Laura nodded slowly. Good. Then she put 2 pieces of paper on the desk and pushed them toward him. Birch picked up the first one. He read it carefully the way Gus had taught him to read documents, starting with the definitions section before the terms. Extension of the service contract. All Nebraska operations, 8 facilities rather than 3. Priority consideration for expansion into Iowa and Kansas in year 2. The monthly retainer figure at the bottom of the page was large enough that Birch read it twice to be certain. He set it down and picked up the second page. The Creative Vocational Foundation. Established 2009. 11 scholarships awarded since its founding to children from agricultural communities, demonstrating exceptional aptitude in mechanical engineering, applied science, or related technical fields. Program covers full tuition and expenses for any accredited technical or university program the recipient chooses to pursue. At the top of the page, in the field where the recipient's name would go, someone had typed Bex Aldrich. Birch did not move for a moment. The page stayed in his hands, but he was not reading it anymore. He was aware of the weight of it, the specific gravity of a piece of paper that meant something real. And he was aware of the office around him, the smell of books and coffee, and the muffled sound of the city outside. And he was aware of Laura Crady sitting across the desk, watching him with an expression that was patient and asked nothing of him right now except to take his time. He set the page down carefully. I want to ask you something before I respond to any of this, he said. Go ahead. Sandra sent you an email asking you to reconsider the contract. Thad Sorrell called me the night before I came here. I need to know whether this meeting is something you decided before those things happened or because of them. Laura reached into the desk drawer and took out her phone. She turned it so the screen faced him and handed it across. It was an email thread, and the timestamp on the earliest message stopped him. 3 weeks ago, 7 days after County Road 7, before the first site visit, before any financial report, before Sandra had written a word of objection. The message was to Bowen Birdsong. It said, Bowen, please prepare a contract proposal for Birch Aldrich of Aldrich Mechanical in Grover Falls. I believe we have found the right person. Begin with the 3 Nebraska facilities and structure for expansion. 3 weeks ago, 1 week after he had driven past a broken tractor on an empty road and stopped because stopping was the right thing to do. Birch handed the phone back. I have spent 40 years building this, Laura said. I have worked with a great many people in that time. Engineers, agronomists, equipment specialists, managers with advanced degrees and extensive portfolios. And I have counted on one hand the people who, when I asked them why they did something, gave me an answer that did not begin with their own interest. She picked up her coffee cup and held it without drinking from it. You said because you were stuck and I could help, and a person should not be charged for somebody doing what is right. I have not forgotten that. Birch looked at the photograph on her desk. Is that your father? Yes. Did he understand what you were building? She was quiet for a moment. He understood it when I bought the second farm. That was 12 years in. Before that, he thought I was prolonging something that should have been sold and moved on from. She set the cup down. He came around, later than I needed him to, but he came around. I'm sorry it took that long. So am I. She looked at him directly. Bex will not have that problem. Not if she is surrounded by people who recognize what she is. Birch looked at the second page again. He thought about Bex at the kitchen table with the engineering primers making notes in the margin in her small, precise handwriting. He thought about her standing beside the John Deere on County Road 7, looking into the engine with an expression of pure, undistracted interest. He thought about her asking Laura whether she liked her farm, and the weight she had given the answer, the way she filed information she intended to use. She is 7, he said. The foundation activates when she reaches high school. There is time. Laura picked up her pen. The question is whether you are willing to let it be on the table while that time passes. Yes, Birch said, to both. He signed the contract extension that afternoon in Bowen Birdsong's office, with Gus Sullen present by phone. Gus said what he had said when Birch signed the first contract, that this was real and that Birch should understand what it meant. This time Birch did not need the words to settle slowly because he had spent 3 months watching what real looked like. The email from Brad Houck arrived 2 days later, not Warren. Brad. The message informed Birch that the property at Route 9 had been placed under a purchase agreement with a private acquisition company, and that the existing lease would be terminated effective 30 days from the date of the letter, rather than the 60 days the original notice had specified. Birch read it standing in the parking lot of the grocery store Beck's inside, with enough cash to get what was on the list, and he stood in the warm May afternoon and understood immediately what had happened. Thad had not gotten the contract, so Thad had moved to the land. He sent the email to Gus, who called back in 40 minutes. The acquisition company was registered in Delaware, 18 months old. Its registered agent, a law firm in Omaha, that also represented several of Thad Sorrell's other business interests. Gus said this without editorial comment, and the silence that followed it said the rest. Birch called Bowen Birdsong. He did not call to ask for help. He called because the situation was information that Crestfield Agricultural, as his primary contract holder, had a legitimate interest in knowing. He laid out the facts in the order they had occurred. He said he was informing Birdsong because transparency was how he operated and because he thought Birdsong would want to know. Birdsong asked 2 clarifying questions. Then he said he would speak with Mrs. Crady and get back to Birch before the end of the day. Bex came out of the grocery store carrying 2 bags in one hand because she liked to see if she could manage it. She reported that the change was right and that she had remembered the item he always forgot. Birch listened and took the bags and drove home without mentioning the email from Brad Houck. That night, after Bex was in bed, Birdsong called back. Mrs. Creedy has asked me to convey that Crestfield Agricultural Holdings maintains a subsidiary real estate division that handles property acquisition for operational purposes. Birdsong said, the property at Route 9 falls within the range of assets that division considers strategically relevant to our Nebraska operations, given that our primary regional service provider operates from that location. Birch was quiet for a moment. She is going to buy it. The division has submitted a competing purchase offer to the Houck family at full market value, with a long-term commercial lease attached for Aldrich Mechanical at a fixed rate for 10 years. Birch sat down on the edge of his workbench. The shop was quiet around him, the tools on the wall in Waverly's order, the logbook on the bench, the space that smelled of metal and oil and accumulated years. Warren Houck accepted the offer this evening, Birdsong continued. The acquisition company Mr. Sorrell was using was not in a position to match the terms. I did not ask her to do this, Birch said. No, Birdsong said. You called to provide information. What Mrs. Creedy decided to do with that information was her decision. After he hung up, Birch sat without moving for a long time. The ground was still under him. The ground was going to stay under him. He let himself feel the full weight of what that meant Not performing the feeling, but actually having it, the complicated mixture of relief and something that was not quite gratitude and not quite humility, but held the qualities of both. Thad called the next morning from a number Birch did not recognize, a personal cell that had not appeared in any previous message. "You won this round, Aldrich?" Birch did not feel the satisfaction the words were designed to look for. "I was not playing around," he said. "I was trying to keep my shop. Same thing from where I am standing." "Not from where I am standing." He paused. "I have no quarrel with you, Sorrel. I never did. You run your business. I will run mine." Thad was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, Birch heard something he had not expected. Not calculation, not the next move being assembled, but something that in a different conversation might have been recognition. "Your father was the same woman," Thad said. "I knew Waverly Aldrich. Not well, but I knew him." "I know," Birch said. He had not known. But it felt true, and the line went quiet after it, and Thad ended the call without another word. Birch set the phone on the bench and stood in the shop thinking about his father for a while. Not the specific memory of any particular day, but the general presence of him, the quality of character that had been in that space before Birch and would outlast Birch in ways he could not yet measure. Thad Sorrell was not a villain. Birch had understood this from the beginning, though. Understanding it had not made any of what Thad did less damaging or the opposition less real. Thad operated according to a logic that was internally coherent. You expanded where you could. You acquired what was available. You used the tools of the market to advance your position in it. There was nothing in that logic that required personal malice. The fact that Birch's shop was in the way of that logic was not Thad's problem from Thad's perspective. It was simply an obstacle, and obstacles were addressed. What Thad had underestimated, Birch thought, was that the same logic applies in reverse. If you operate according to a clear principle, and you do what you do because it is right rather than because it is advantageous, the world occasionally conspires to make those two things align. Not always, not reliably enough to count on, but sometimes. And when it happens, it is not luck exactly. It is more like the accumulated consequence of 1,000 small decisions made in the right direction, finally arriving somewhere visible. His father had understood that. Waverly Aldrich had not been a philosophically inclined man in the way of someone who read books about ethics or discussed principles over dinner. But he had operated according to a clear one, and he had maintained it so consistently that it had become indistinguishable from his character, and his character had become indistinguishable from his reputation. And his reputation had persisted past his death in the people who knew him well enough to recognize it in his son. That was the thing that had saved Aldrich Mechanical. Not strategy, not timing, not the right call made to the right person at the right moment. The thing that had saved it was a quality of character that had been built before Birch was born, passed to him in the years he spent watching his father work, and expressed on a Tuesday morning in April in the 20 minutes he spent on the side of an empty road for no reason other than that it was the right thing to do. Sandra Dunbar came to the shop on a Tuesday 8 weeks into the extended contract. She drove herself, arrived at 9 in the morning without calling ahead, and knocked on the door the way someone knocks when they are not sure of their welcome, but have decided to show up anyway. Birch stepped back to let her in without making her explain herself first. She had a folder under her arm, and she set it on the bench and opened it and pointed to the figure at the bottom of the summary column. The quarterly numbers. $163,000 in avoided repair costs at Millard County alone. "This is what I owe you," she said. "Not money. Something else." "You were doing your job," Birch said. "I was doing my job in a way that assumed I already knew the outcome." She looked at the folder rather than at him. "I have been in this position for 11 years. I have watched a great many people come in with good projections and produce different results. I made an assumption about you that the data does not support. The assumption was reasonable given what you had to work with. It was wrong." She closed the folder. Then she looked at the logbook on the corner of the bench, the green cover worn soft at the corners, the spine cracked from years of use. Walker used a software platform. Everything was digitized, searchable, automatically flagged. No one sat with the physical records. She paused. "You found the storage pattern because you read the history of each machine against the calendar. The software could not do that because no one had programmed it to look for that question." "That is exactly it," Birch said. "I understand that now." She picked up her folder. "Mrs. Creedy told me about the foundation. For your daughter. Yes, she has awarded 11 scholarships in 15 years. She does not discuss the selection process with anyone, including Birdsong. Sandra held his gaze steadily. This is the first time she has informed a member of her own staff about a recipient before the formal announcement. Birch said nothing. I thought you should know that, Sandra said. She left and Birch stood in the doorway watching her car until it turned onto the main road, and then he stood in the quiet morning a while longer before going back to work. The admission Sandra had just made was the most direct one she was capable of, and he received it as such. Some people can only apologize through the precise description of where they were wrong. That was its own kind of honesty. 6 months after County Road 7, Aldrich Mechanical moved into a proper commercial space in Grover Falls. The building was on a lot owned by a Crestfield agricultural subsidiary, the same entity that now held Route 9, and the lease was fixed for 10 years at a rate Birch could build around. The space was larger than the converted barn had been, with room for 2 lifts and a parts storage area, in a small office with a window looking out onto the parking lot. Birch arranged it the way he arranged everything, starting with what mattered most. The tool wall went up first. The hooks were placed in the order his father had used. He hired 2 people. The first was Danny Pollard, 29, who had been doing engine work at a shop in Omaha and wanted to be closer to his family in the county. He was direct and quick and had the useful quality of knowing exactly how much he knew and where his knowledge ended, which made him easy to work with and easy to trust. The second was Helen Vass, 33, a former equipment technician from an agricultural operation in Kansas that had been absorbed by a corporate consolidator and was looking for a shop that ran like a real shop. Helen had 7 years of direct experience with the exact category of equipment that dominated Crestfield's Nebraska operations, and she had opinions about maintenance protocols that she was not shy about sharing, and Birch found her opinions consistently worth considering. He spent 3 days walking both of them through the systems. He used the logbook notation method and the seasonal scheduling approach, and the way he organized service histories by equipment unit rather than by date, which allowed him to read any machine's full biography in sequence rather than reconstructing it from calendar entries. Danny asked questions throughout. Helen asked fewer questions, but the questions she asked cut to the center of whatever was being explained. By the end of the 3rd day, Birch was confident that both of them understood not just the procedures, but the reasoning behind the procedures, and that understanding the reasoning was what would allow them to handle the situations the procedures had not anticipated. He moved the logbook last. He carried it from the truck himself and set it on the corner of the new bench in the new office, and it looked right there. The green cover worn at the corners, the spine cracked just so. The 2 sets of handwriting visible through the open pages, distinct from each other and continuous with each other at the same time. The morning before the official first day, he arrived before anyone else. He had done this with the barn too, 6 years ago, the morning before he opened Aldrich Mechanical for the first time. He had sat in his truck then as well, with a coffee that had gone slightly cool, looking at the sign he had painted himself, because he could not afford to have it made professionally, and because painting it himself felt right in a way he had not bothered to analyze. He had thought about his father that morning. He was thinking about his father this morning. That was probably always going to be true. That was not a loss. That was the thing his father had been trying to tell him in the letter, he thought now. Not that grief goes away or that the weight of absence becomes lighter, but that you can carry it forward instead of being stopped by it. You can keep going for the people in front of you, the way the people who came before you kept going for you, and in that continuity, something persists that is larger than any individual and more durable than any particular loss. He sat in his truck in the parking lot with a cup of coffee and looked at the sign above the door. The sign company had put it up the previous evening. The same name, the same general form. Larger than the version above the barn door because the building was larger and the proportions required it. Aldrich Mechanical. He took the envelope out of his shirt pocket. He had moved it there from the medicine cabinet 3 weeks ago on a morning when he had reached for the aspirin and found it and stood in the bathroom for a long time. Not to carry it as a talisman or a reminder. To carry it because he had decided it was time, and deciding required having it close. He looked at his father's handwriting on the outside. The care of it. Waverly Aldrich had formed his letters with the precision of a man who believed that the way you did small things was the same way you did large things, that the quality of character was not divisible, that it showed in everything or it showed in nothing. He opened it. Inside was a single piece of notebook paper folded twice the same stock Waverly had used in the logbook. The message was short. His father had never been a man for long messages when short ones would carry the weight. It read, "Birch, if you are reading this, you have reached the place I reached once. I did not know what to do either. I want you to know that. I want you to know I figured it out anyway, not because I was certain, but because I could not let you watch me stop trying. Keep going for Bex the way I kept going for you. That is enough. It always was. Love, Dad." Birch sat with the paper in his hands. He was not aware of feeling any single thing. It was several things at once, grief and gratitude, and something that was close to relief but was not quite relief. It was more like the feeling of arriving somewhere after a long journey and finding that the place is exactly what you expected and nothing like what you had imagined, and that the difference between those two things is the most important thing. He had figured it out, not because he was certain, because he had kept going. Bex knocked on the truck window. She had arrived with Danny, who had given her a ride since Birch had told her she could come for the opening, and her school did not start until 9. She was wearing an orange jacket and carrying the black notebook, and she looked at him through the glass with the direct gaze she always used, checking without asking whether he was all right. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his wallet next to the photograph of Bex and the small photograph of his father he had carried there for 12 years. 3 things in one place. The same order as the mirror in the bathroom. His daughter first. The obligations that kept them standing. His father last and never forgotten. He got out of the truck. "Name's still the same," Bex said, looking up at the sign. "Yes, it is. But everything else is different. Most of it." He put his hand on her shoulder. "That is a good thing." She considered the sign for another moment with the particular seriousness she brought to things she had already thought about before being asked. "Did you open it?" She did not specify what. She did not need to. "I did." "Was it what you thought it would be?" "Better," he said. She took his hand, which she did not always do anymore, and they stood together in the early morning, looking at the name above the door. The fields beyond the edge of town were green and certain. Behind them in the building, Danny was unlocking the side entrance. Helen's car was pulling into the lot. The day was beginning the way days begin when you have built something that can receive them. Laura came that afternoon. She did not call ahead. She drove the pickup, parked in an unmarked spot, came through the main entrance, with her hands in her jacket pockets, and moved through the space the way she moved through everything, steadily gathering information and drawing her own conclusions. Danny was under a machine. Helen was at a gearbox on the bench. Bex was at the small desk in the corner of the office, homework spread around her, the black notebook open beside the textbook. Birch was reviewing a service schedule when he heard the door. He met her in the center of the shop. "Looks right," she said. "Getting there." She looked past him toward the office window where Bex was visible through the glass, bent over her work pen, moving with the focused economy of someone who knows what they are trying to say. "She reminds me of someone," Laura said. "Your father. Myself." She said it plainly without sentiment. At that age, the way she looks at things, like she has already decided she is going to understand them, and it is only a matter of time and attention. Birch looked at his daughter through the glass. "She told me last week that she wants to understand why systems fail. Not just mechanical systems, all systems. She said every system has a flaw built into its design, and the people who matter are the ones who find it before the failure does." Laura was quiet for a moment. 7 years old. 7. Where does she get that? "From watching," Birch said. "She watches everything, and she does not waste what she sees." Laura nodded once. She looked around the shop. The tool wall, the lifts, the logbook visible on the bench through the office window, the sign readable through the front door from where they were standing. "Your father built something worth keeping," she said. "He did. You kept it. I almost did not, but you did." She said it the way she said things that were simply true and did not require elaboration. The almost does not count in the final record. She did not stay long. She never stayed long. She shook his hand at the door the way she had shaken it on County Road 7, firmly without ceremony, and then she drove away, and the afternoon settled back around the shop, the way afternoons settle when the important conversation has finished and the work can continue. Birch stood at the door for another moment after her pickup turned out of the lot and onto the main road. He thought about the first time he had seen that pickup on County Road 7, parked at an angle behind the tractor, in the ditch. He thought about Laura standing beside it with her phone in her hand, not talking, looking up at the sky with the patience of someone who had been in difficult situations before and knew that they resolved themselves eventually if you did not make them worse by panicking. He had not known stopping on that road that he was making any kind of decision. He had known only that someone needed help and he could provide it, and that the provision of help in those circumstances was not a choice that required deliberation. His father had said something like this once, not as a principle, but as an observation, watching Birch hesitate before stopping to help a neighbor with a stuck gate on a cold December evening. Waverly had said the question of whether to help is not actually a question. That one is already answered. The only question is the how. Birch had been 17. He had remembered it the way you remember things said at the right moment when you are old enough to hear them and young enough that they still go in cleanly. He went back to work. Birch stood at the door for a moment after she left. He thought about a Tuesday in April and a road he had not planned to be on, and a tractor sitting in a ditch, and a woman looking up at the sky who had not been waiting to be rescued. He thought about the 20 minutes he had spent with a rolled canvas kit on the side of that road and the answer he had given to a question about why. He had not stopped because he expected anything from it. He had not stopped because he knew who she was, or what the morning might become, or how one decision on an empty road could change the direction of everything that followed. He had stopped because there was a person who needed help, and he had the ability to provide it, and there was nothing more complicated than that. That was the whole of it. Everything else had grown from that one simple fact, the way certain things grow quietly without needing to be watched or hurried or convinced of their own direction. He went back to work. Danny and Helen were still inside finishing their respective tasks with the quiet competence of people who have been given clear work and know how to complete it. Birch could hear Helen describing something to Danny in the low, even voice she used when she was explaining a procedure, and he could hear Danny asking the follow-up question that showed he had understood the first part. The shop had a sound now that the barn had not had for years, the sound of more than one person working in a coordinated way, the productive low-level noise of a place that had enough going on to have its own ambient register. His father's shop had sounded like that at its best moments. That evening, he drove home on County Road 7, not the fastest route, his route. The light was going down slow and golden over the Nebraska fields, the long May light that lingers at the edge of the day, as though it is in no particular hurry to be done, and the road was empty and straight and unchanged in all the ways that roads are unchanged even after everything around them has shifted. He stopped the truck at the place he knew by memory now, at the shoulder where he had pulled over on a Tuesday in April that felt like a lifetime ago, and was in the ways that matter exactly that. The ditch was empty. The road stretched away in both directions under a sky going slowly amber and violet at the edges. There was nothing remarkable about the spot, nothing to mark it as different from any other stretch of county road, just gravel and grass and the particular quality of quiet that settles in the space between one place and another. Bex was asleep in the back arm trailing over the seat edge, the black notebook resting on her lap, same as that morning months ago when everything had still been uncertain. Same posture, same book, same light fading in the same direction. Almost everything looked the same. Nothing was the same. Birch looked at his daughter in the rearview mirror for a long moment. He thought about the letter in his wallet and the tools on the wall in the order his father had left them, and the logbook with two sets of handwriting moving through the same pages, different hands making the same kind of record. He thought about Lore saying the almost does not count in the final record, and he thought about Sandra describing what the software could not find and what reading the physical history made visible. He thought about Bex's orange diagram with the colors chosen because hot is orange and cool is blue, and that is just what they feel like. He thought about Warren Houck not answering the phone on a Tuesday morning and how that silence had sent him driving without a destination, and how without a destination he had ended up on County Road 7, and how on County Road 7 there had been a woman who needed help and a man who stopped because stopping was the right thing to do. He could not have planned any of it. He could not have engineered the sequence of events that led from a letter in a shirt pocket to a scholarship with his daughter's name on it, and a lease fixed for 10 years, and a shop with room to grow. What he could do, what he had always been able to do, was show up honestly to whatever was in front of him and do the work as well as it could be done and treat people the way they deserve to be treated. His father had taught him that, not in a single conversation, but in the accumulated evidence of a life lived that way in the logbook, in the tools, in the order of the hooks, and the quality of attention Waverly Aldrich had brought to everything, including strangers who needed help on an empty road. Birch thought about the letter in his wallet, the careful handwriting in the short message, and the instruction that had turned out not to be an instruction at all, but a statement of faith. I figured it out anyway, not because I was certain, but because I could not let you watch me stop trying. Keep going for Bex the way I kept going for you. He looked at Bex in the rearview mirror. She was so still when she slept, so thoroughly absent from the waking world in a way that she never was when she was awake. Awake, she was always at attention and always gathering something, always filing what she found into whatever system of understanding she was currently building. Asleep, she was simply a 7-year-old with her arm trailing over the seat edge and a notebook on her lap and the whole long future of her life spread out in front of her, unwritten, waiting. He thought about what Lore had said. The almost does not count in the final record. He thought about what Sandra had said. The pattern was in the physical history of the machines. He thought about what Thad had said. The last surprising thing, your father was the same way. He thought about Warren Houck calling because the weight of not calling was heavier than the weight of the conversation. He thought about Gus saying this is real Birch in the particular voice Gus used when he wanted something to land and stay landed. He thought about a Tuesday morning in April, the letter in the shirt pocket. The $43, the 9 rings of a phone that did not answer, the tentative green of the fields and the tractor in the ditch, and the woman looking up at the sky and the simple fact of stopping because stopping was right. He thought about Beck standing beside the John Deere looking at the engine with the focused expression she brought to things that interested her, which was the same expression she brought to the engineering primers and the astronomy volumes and the hydraulic diagrams. She colored orange and blue to show the pressure and the return. He thought about his father, always last, never forgotten. The sky was nearly dark now, the first stars beginning to show themselves in the east with the patience of things that have always been present and simply wait for the light to change enough to make them visible. The road in front of him was the same road in both directions, and you could not tell from where he sat which way led toward the things that would matter and which way led away from them. That was the nature of roads and of most choices. You could not know in advance which ones would be the ones that changed everything. You could only draw toward what seemed right with the people who mattered to you and trust that honesty and care and the willingness to stop when stopping was the right thing to do would take you somewhere worth arriving. He put the truck in gear. He drove home.